Welcome to Of the Sacred podcast. This is your host, Wondesen. We live in a fast paced world, one where many of us no longer have the time to sit with long novels or dense philosophical works. Yet these classics still speak powerfully to our condition. That's why this podcast exists. Here I try to summarize and reflect on the central themes of classic novels, writings, and poems. Not to replace reading, of course, but to make their ideas accessible for people in a hurry. Today I will briefly explore the Metamorphosis by Franz Kafka, one of the most unsettling and influential writers of modern literature. Franz Kafka was a Czech born, German language writer of Jewish heritage whose fiction profoundly shaped 20th century literature. His works, marked by surreal logic, alienation, and bureaucratic dread, produced the adjective Kafkaesque, describing situations both absurd and oppressively complex. This episode is not about every detail of the metamorphosis, it's about the question Kafka forces us to confront. What happens to a human being when their value disappears? Let's begin. Imagine you wake up one morning and discovering that you are no longer useful, not to your job, not to your family, not even to yourself. There is no warning, there is no explanation. This is how the metamorphosis begins, not with the transformation of the world, but with the collapse of meaning. Kafka does not ask, "What if you become a monster?" He asks something far more disturbing. What if your value was always conditional, and now the condition is gone? Gregor Samsa, the main character in the book, wakes up transformed into a gigantic insect. Kafka gives us no cause, no curse, no scientific experiment gone wrong. There is no mythology to soften the blow. And here is the first existential shock. Gregor's greatest fear is not his body, it's that he will be late for work. Even after becoming something unrecognizable, Gregor still thinks like an employee. His identity has been so thoroughly fused with productivity that even dehumanization cannot free him from it. Kafka is telling us something brutal. Modern life trains us to measure our worth before we ever question our existence. At first, Gregor's family is horrified but hopeful. They feed him, they tolerate him, they wait. But slowly, something changes. Gregor can no longer earn, he can no longer provide, and love begins to erode. Kafka exposes a truth many prefer not to name. Love in practice is often conditional, especially within systems shaped by economic survival. The family does not become cruel overnight, they become tired. And tiredness, as Kafka suggests, is often the birthplace of moral collapse. Gregor understands everything. He hears every conversation. He feels shame, guilt, and longing. But he cannot speak, since he is a giant insect. This is existential isolation at its purest. To be conscious, aware, and emotionally alive, yet unable to participate in human world. Kafka anticipates a modern anxiety, the fear that inner life does not guarantee outer recognition. You can suffer deeply and still be dismissed as a burden. The insect is not the point. Kafka never describes it clearly because it could be anything: illness, depression, aging, poverty, immigration, spiritual crisis. Transformation reveals what was already true. Gregor was valued for what he did, not for who he was. Existentially, this is Kafka's warning. If your identity is built entirely on function, then the loss of function becomes the loss of self. Gregor dies quietly. There is no redemption, no moral reversal, and the family feels relief. They go outside, they plan their future, life improves. Kafka refuses consolation. He leaves us with a question that lingers among after the final page. If someone disappears and the world becomes easier, what does that say about the world or about us? The metamorphosis is not a story about becoming less than human. It is about discovering how fragile humanity already is. Kafka forces us to ask, who are we when we are no longer useful? And who remains with us when usefulness disappears? That question, not the insect, is the true horror. This has been the metamorphosis, read not as a fantasy but as a mirror. And like all honest mirrors, it does not comfort, it reveals. If this reflection spoke to you, subscribe to Of the Sacred podcast for concise insights into classic literature, philosophy, and sacred questions for people in a hurry. Your support helps keep this conversation alive. Thank you very much.